somebody come up to me with wide eyes and say, I could follow your directions.
She was a person that caused things to happen.
She just loved the innovative use of something traditional.
She was a good engineer who happened to be an artist.
Viginia Isham Harvey, curator, writer, inventor, entrepreneur, and mentor, suffered a massive stroke 10 days before we were scheduled to film her. She died a month later.
I think that we all remember her for giving of her knowledge, of her time, and of her joy of using fibers.
Viginia Harvey's influence is so much a part of the current world of textile arts that it is difficult to recognize. In a sense, her life work became a part of the aesthetic air fiber artists breathe. By spending countless hours documenting processes and studiously sharing her information with other aspiring artists through her books, workshops, and personal relationships, she altered the world of textile arts irrevocably.
Viginia was the Ben Franklin of the scene. She never became president. She didn't write the Declaration of Independence. She was an egghead and an observer.
She really followed her passion in just as far back as I can remember, and she was very, very focused.
We all were influenced by Viginia Harvey and the availability of the textile collection for research.
I always said I had the best job on campus.
Based on a research project she did with the Seattle Weavers Guild, Viginia was hired in 1958 as the first preparator and later curator at the University of Washington Textile Studies Center, now part of the university's Henry Art Gallery. At midlife, with no college degree, Viginia found herself in an influential position at a major university.
It was a unique model for other collection managers. It was a time when computers, of course, were not being used for collection management, and she had a manual retrieval system, so someone could come through and they could look up things from a certain country or a state or a city by date, usually by decade or century, by function, by medium and technique, how it was constructed and put together. And there were all kinds of subject headings, including they started identifying all of the embroidery stitches on the pieces. The compactor storage system that she designed was wonderful. Viginia told me the story about talking to the carpenters and trying to explain to them the idea that she had. It's sort of, she said, if you take a chest of drawers and you turn it on its side and pretend like the drawers are the units, and then you connect it across so that they pull across ways, then you've got it.
When I was a student of textile history under Grace Denny on this campus, it amounted to opening drawers and carefully removing tissue paper and taking out something. First, every student had to wash their hands. We weren't to touch things, but just we had to be ultra clean. And the fabric was carefully laid out. And then the whole next day was spent putting them back, carefully back in the drawers. And that was true in New York museums, and generally that's the way textiles were viewed. Viginia revolutionized all of that, saying you're not supposed to be handling textiles and folding and unfolding them and so on. The way you look for them is in our files, and there'll be a photograph and a full description of everything about it, including the size of the thread and how it's sewn if it is, and so forth. And then if you really have to look at some firsthand, they will be rolled up with acid-free paper, and then that will be wrapped with plastic, and we will store those on tubes with a rod through them and hanging. All of that became international. The American museums have all changed to that system, and the Deutsche Textile Museum in Germany, the Kremlin textiles, use the Virginia HARVEY system. So I'm mighty impressed and proud of my local girl.
I think that's why she was so good at what she did, is because she could visualize it and then do it. And it turned out the way she, for the most part, the way she saw it, or the way she thought. It's,
well, not only the storage, but the system she came up with to catalog the textiles and that. She said that between those two that she felt that was one of her biggest accomplishments, and it's used worldwide.
Yes, it's a legacy that I've had to, a torch I've had to hold high.
You learn more about a single subject than anybody else ever knows, and the world will find a path to your door. It's a philosophy that I don't know that I consciously followed, but I have followed.
And come to her door they did. Virginia's first book, Macramé, The Art of Creative Knotting, started a revolution of macramé in the late 1960s. For many people, her easy-to-understand instructions and drawings opened the doors to the world of fiber art.
She first did the knots and fully understood them and how they were worked, and then she used drawing as communication.
when she was doing the macramé book, I know that myself and probably you too were experimented on a lot. Here, can you make this work? You know, and there was a lot of that sort of thing, and we'd sit down and try to follow it. And that's the reason it was so successful, I think, because people could take the book and make it happen.
In an era when virtually all art textiles were woven on a loom, Virginia's book and subsequent articles on knotting, plaiting, wrapping, and other non-loom textile techniques encouraged an explosion of creative expression. Her ideas caught fire with a generation that was elevating the concept of handmade and rejecting the stigma associated with homemade.
She was excited about the fact that this book was making such an influence on people, but she realized that macrame just started getting horrible, that people were making pot hangers and other awful things, and she didn't want to feel responsible for that happening.
However, in the hands of talented artists in the late 1960s and 70s, macrame and other repopularized textile techniques, including basketry, were incorporated into dynamic contemporary artworks. Virginia's books on knotting and basket construction were a significant contribution to a period of great artistic fermentation in the fiber arts.
It was macrame that really started the workshop tours. Either craftspeople or groups of craftspeople asked her, come and teach us this, or come and give us a class on this, and it kind of snowballed.
As a result, Virginia and her husband Bill became entrepreneurs. Not only did they travel the country so Virginia could teach workshops and sell books, but they also set up Why Not, K-N-O-T, a supply company that sold yarns and materials for macrame and other fiber projects. Their supply company grew rapidly into a wholesale business that the Harveys eventually sold to a group in Tacoma, Washington.
After that book and after I did a lot of workshops, people wanted more information on macrame all the time. And I proposed a second book.
But Van Nostrum Reinhold wouldn't be interested in another book on macrame for another 15 years. So Virginia started publishing a quarterly subscription newsletter called Threads in Action.
I decided to do Threads in Action in order to fill a need, because I was getting so many requests for further information about macrame. I started out primarily with macrame. I hooked them that way, but it was my intention to go on into many other textile thread techniques.
The macrame became braids, the braids became baskets, the baskets became, it just worked into so many interesting things.
There are lots of things besides macrame, sure. That you don't have to have a loom to do.
Every time it came, you didn't know what you were going to be interested in next.
But Viginia Harvey knew. Her book, The Techniques of Basketry, was published in 1976. The manuscript barely escaped a devastating house fire that forced Virginia to stop publication of Threads in Action.
We'll never know how much it set her back, in terms of where she'd been if it hadn't happened. But it had to be a loss of the library, and a lot of the things she was doing had to be a stumbling block for her. But she never looked back.
I always look forward, and it was a tragedy, and I never will recover from losing the animals that way.
She managed to pick up the pieces, and it took a while to get her momentum back up. And like Russ said, during this time, the Bateman project took an enormous chunk of her time.
What Dr. Bateman did was he combined a lot of the weaves together and made up entirely new weaves and classifications. His family gave them to Virginia to be published.
Most of the work was interpreting his directions and putting them down in the form that weavers usually use, with the draft and the tie-up and the treadling.
Virginia started doing the checking and the writing, and she got into it so far that she couldn't let it go.
It was 10 years after I started before all of the monographs were completed.
She was like a bulldog with a bone. She had to do the whole thing and do it perfectly, and she did it.
I gave them to the Seattle Weavers Guild with the stipulation that they set up a system whereby they could be borrowed by people either locally or not locally. I'd rather see them worn out than kept forever.
Yeah, right.
There's such a wealth of information there.
She embraced a much wider world than most academicians. She could keep up with serious scholars on highly specialized subject and still chat with the woman who happened to weave next door, and embrace such a broad spectrum of levels of interest and so on. That's unusual.
When you talked to her about these various groups, she was one of the group. They all contributed, and it was kind of an equal process as far as she was concerned. A lot of the other people in the group really viewed her as their leader and as their mentor. She never felt that way.
The unorganized stitchers are fairly organized sometimes. We're organized enough so that we can have 4 meetings a year, and we meet in one another's houses, and in summertime we go to camp. And we stay there for about 4 days, and we do workshops. We teach each other things that we've learned over the past year, or something that somebody else has taught us that we want to pass along to the group.
We feed off of each other to some extent, because one has an idea and the other one takes it on farther or whatever.
She always had something to teach us, which was her thing. She loved to pass things on that she had learned to other people, and we were a great audience. We gave her a bad time, but we were a great audience.
Out of this powerful group of 20 cutting-edge needle artists, some 30 books have been written and published over the past 40 years. Encouraged by Viginia Harvey, who led by example, these women have made many significant contributions to the textile arts with their publications.
She taught you without appearing to do so. And
yeah, low key.
Very low key, mostly inspirational, and she had the way of hitting your button to get you going and get you excited about things.
This is felting, but instead of using water, you use a needle.
In the world of textile arts, much of the research being done happens in small study groups and is only taught in workshop situations. The Brady Bunch and Unorganized Stitchers are two examples of this, accomplished craftspeople doing extended research, sharing information in a group, with Virginia at the center.
Some sort of a, just a kind of a spiral.
The Brady Bunch has probably been meeting at my house for 4 or 5 years. A group of us of the Whitby Weavers Guild were interested in exploring braiding.
What's interesting about braiding is that it'll conform and to shape real well. And so you don't get the bunching and binding that you get with other textiles or stitching. Yeah. We
were just going to get together and reproduce the braids and learn what the structures were and so forth. I have a notebook full of braids that I did.
This was a shoe we were working on. It's on the market now. The designer that built this is Viginia, but I shared the idea of this with Virginia because I wanted to try to take the concept of braiding further and try to create an entire three-dimensional object that I could turn into a shoe. She just had all kinds of ideas and people I could contact, and by the time we were done talking, she had the whole table was full of books that she took out of her library for me to look through.
This is the active one. And it goes,
now, why do you call it active? Because it goes through?
Virginia Harvey said so.
Oh.
Yes, because it goes through.
Despite Virginia's reluctance to be viewed as a leader or mentor, Jack Lenore Larson, President Emeritus of the American Craft Council, saw her that way.
I nominated her as an honorary fellow for her contribution in textiles. Well deserved and undisputed.
I think her main focus was always to explore and record traditional techniques with the hope that people would take those and do something unusual with them.
The problem that they gave me is that in outer space there is a lot of very fine, sharp debris from the asteroids and that kind of thing that will cut the fibers in any kind of a tether that is designed.
So I needed to come up with a structure that was made of multiple lines that were interconnected but didn't collapse when you pulled on the end of it, and I didn't know how I was going to do that.
It was a very exciting challenge for her, and she was just, she wasn't doing anything else. And it only took her, like, I think, a couple weeks to figure it out.
It would be a big circular net with all of these connections every yard or so, and the whole thing would be a big structure that would be out in space. We would have a space station on one end that had power supplies and controls and everything else. And it would be slowly rotating about once every 15 minutes. And at the end of it would be this tether going round in space. And at the bottom, it would be going slow enough at the tip so that it pick up a passenger capsule in an airplane that just gets out of the atmosphere, and then pick it up and throw it to Mars or the Moon. So that once you have these large rotating cables in space, you have not just gone there once, you've set up a two-way transportation system that can throw things back and forth.
And so you need to design a tether in which elements of it can be cut and it will still maintain its integrity. And this will do that.
When I pull on the end of it, it does go through a little bit of bend here, but it doesn't knot on itself. So this is just as strong as it used to be before it was braided with these other two. And this is one of the side braids, and this is the other side braid, and this is the Isham interconnection, named after Viginia Isham, who later married Mr. Harvey.
She took a Paleolithic concept and changed it into this millennium space age and enormous size, but also the strength it would have to anchor a spaceship with an ancient knotted structure. It takes a mind, and she had it.
From a very young age, she was 18 years old when she did the drawings and designed my grandfather's veterinary hospital and house. You know, it was a two-story house, veterinary hospital with an office, surgery, pharmaceutical room, furnace, a run for the dogs. It had an incinerator, different labs, and it was built from her drawings. She just designed it and they built it.
Virginia said if it had been a different time, that's what she truly wanted to do, was be an engineer.
I loved math, and I enjoyed art, and I learned to weave.
When she invented the round loom, she was working at the University of Washington, and she took that into one of the engineering department in the master's program and talked to a professor about seeing if they could design a system for the sheds and that on it, and they couldn't come up with anything better than what she already had. She gave me a erector set for Christmas, and she she took my motor out of it and made a bobbin winder, mounted it to a board and hooked it all up like that, you know. And I thought building the erector set wasn't nearly as much fun without a motor, but she was off and running with that.
This is the tapestries that I have been designing and weaving on as I watch television in the evenings. And they're on a small bamboo frame, a black bamboo frame. And in order to get these frames, you cut down a lot of bamboo in order to get elements that work together.
It's just very, very fine work. And nobody in their right mind would probably do that, except Virginia. She just loved to work very, very fine and make these wonderful little patterned things.
I really feel like that the older she got, the more prolific she got, the more productive.
In her retirement years, she was enjoying producing a lot of work, small pieces, very delicate pieces.
This is one that I've started just recently, and they're all silk wefts that are being used. Actually, I've got a lot of odds and ends of silks, and this is also a way of using them up.
Virginia made these wonderful necklaces using black bamboo, little pieces of black bamboo, and then she'd wrap the corners to hold them together. And then in this case, she strung threads going in both directions and then did these God's eyes.
You have to be very careful not to overwhelm the design by adding little pieces to it. So it's a challenge in design, and I like to leave open areas for the bamboo to show. It relates to all of this business that's going on up here.
One of the more recent things she did was these little triangles. Basically what she does is she uses a sticky paper on here to hold the threads so they don't just slide off the points. And then she just wraps these threads around, and it looks very complicated. And then she arranges them into patterns such as that. And she then makes these wonderful cards out of them.
I was reading a book on Escher that I bought for Russ for Christmas, and he still hasn't received it. There's a system of designing repeat pattern in Escher that I started playing with, and this is one of those designs that has been reduced, has been colored and then reduced, and I've made cards of them.
It seemed like the more complicated the piece was, the more challenge and the more fun it was for her. The show that she had was more of her work assembled in one place than I'd ever seen. The piece that she was working on when she died was just the most beautiful piece. It took her 2 years to make the cartoon, which is the drawing that you put behind the warp on these little looms. And this was a fairly major piece, you know, 1 foot by 2 feet or so. She said, "This is my life's project." And it was, as it turned out. It was only got about 2 inches at the bottom finished because it was so fine and so beautiful.
I'd like to be able to put other people in the position that I was in order to live their lives. It's been a very, very happy life.